There is a number that needs no context. 1,100,000 people murdered in a single place. Not on a battlefield. Not in the crossfire of warring armies. In a complex built expressly for killing. In southern occupied Poland, on the banks of the Soa River. In a town the Germans called Auschwitz, and the Poles had always called Oświęcim. Auschwitz was not one camp, it was a system. At its greatest extent, between 1943 and 1944. The complex consisted of 3 main camps: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz I Birkenau, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, and 45 satellite subcamps scattered across the Upper Silesian region. More than 700 hectares of organized terror, overseen by thousands of SS men, where every aspect of human existence was regulated down to the last minute for one explicit purpose: to extract useful labor until the body gave out, or to immediately annihilate those who were of no use for labor in the first place. Within that electrified perimeter lived different categories of prisoners, and their experience of the same day, at the same hour, was radically different. The ordinary prisoner, the one who carried bricks, dug trenches, and marched out with the labor detail through the snow, lived a different day from the capo who supervised him. Different from that of the prisoner doctor forced to work in the infirmary. Different from that of the slave laborer whom the SS rented to IG Farben's synthetic rubber plant at Monowitz. Different from that of the Sonderkommando member who spent his day inside the crematoria. They all shared the same camp, the same perimeter, the same Polish sky, but those 24 hours were not the same for any of them. What follows is the story of those 24 hours. 4:15 in the morning, the whistle that knew no mercy, a sharp, prolonged whistle, allowing no possible transition between sleep and wakefulness. In the summer months, the sky above Birkenau was already beginning to lighten, a gray band appearing along the eastern horizon. In winter, the darkness was absolute, and the Polish cold bit with temperatures that could fall below -20 degrees Celsius in January. Either way, the hour never changed. 4:15 in the morning was Reveille at Auschwitz II Birkenau, the largest of the complex's 3 main camps, which at the height of its population held more than 90,000 prisoners at the same time. The ordinary prisoner, let us call him what he was, a number heard that whistle from inside a barrack that had not been built for human beings. Most of Birkenau's barracks were prefabricated wooden stables, originally designed by the German army to house 52 horses. In 1943, when Birkenau's population reached its peak, each of those barracks held between 400 and 1,000 people. 3-tiered wooden bunks, built from unplaned boards, filled the space from end to end. Less than 60 centimeters separated the upper tier from the roof. Those who slept on the lower levels lived with the water that seeped across the packed earth floor whenever it rained, and with rats that ran fearlessly through the barracks at night. The blockälteste, the prisoner in charge of the barrack, who slept in a small separate room beside the entrance, was the first to rise. His task during those first few minutes was to make sure no one delayed. He had a stick. He used it. The ordinary prisoner had exactly 15 minutes to do everything. Everything meant climbing down from the bunk without falling, something difficult for anyone who had spent weeks or months in the camp and whose legs were swollen from starvation edema, or whose ankles were covered in open sores caused by wooden clogs. It meant reaching the communal latrines, stone or wooden blocks containing between 60 and 90 holes arranged in a row, with no partitions and no privacy, and getting the chance to use them, even though the lines were so long that many never reached the front in time. Being punished for failing to make it back in time was a real possibility. During those moments, the capos and blockälteste struck prisoners with the same casualness with which a foreman might shout at a slow worker. Kitty Hart Moxon, who arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in April 1943 at the age of 16, recalled decades later that the morning latrine was one of the most vulnerable moments of the day, not only because of the physical conditions, the smell, the cold, and the frantic rush, but because the crowding created opportunities for theft and violence among the prisoners themselves. Bread saved from the previous evening, if someone had hidden it beneath their clothing or under the straw, could disappear during those few minutes. The capo of the labor detail also awoke at 4:15. But his morning was different. The capo slept in an individual bunk, in a separate area of the same barrack, or in some cases in barracks reserved for supervisory prisoners. He had a blanket. he had more space. In many cases, he had access to supplementary rations that ordinary prisoners would never see. The capo rose, thinking about the working day ahead, how many men he would be assigned during roll call that morning, and whether the SS Blockführer would be in a bad mood. The member of the Sonderkommando also awoke at that hour, although in a radically different place. The Sonderkommando, the special detachment, slept in the basements of Birkenau's crematoria themselves. Not by choice. The SS kept them physically isolated from the rest of the camp in order to preserve the secrecy of what took place inside those facilities. Their sleeping quarters were underground, only a few meters from the undressing rooms where they had worked just hours earlier. Sonderkommando members received better rations than the other prisoners. They had access to alcohol, which the SS deliberately supplied to them, according to the testimony of Philipp Müller, a survivor who spent more than 3 years in the Sonderkommando. They also possessed certain objects that were unavailable to the rest of the camp. None of this changed what they saw when they opened their eyes at 4:15 in the morning, a few kilometers from Birkenau, at the Monowitz subcamp. Another prisoner awoke at a slightly different hour, determined not by the SS but by the production requirements of a private company. Monowitz, known internally as Buna, had been built beginning in 1942 to supply slave labor to IG Farben's synthetic rubber and fuel plant, the largest chemical conglomerate in Germany. The SS charged the company 3 Reichsmarks per day for each unskilled worker, 4 for each skilled worker, and 1.5 for each child. Unlike Birkenau, Monowitz's barracks had windows and heating in winter, a material difference that did nothing to alter the central fact. The life expectancy of a Jewish worker at Buna was 3 to 4 months. For those working in the mines associated with the complex, it was barely 1 month. The prisoner doctor, a prisoner with medical training who worked in the camp infirmary, also rose at that hour. His experience of dawn was different from that of the ordinary prisoner, because he knew exactly what awaited him over the next several hours, and that knowledge was a burden in itself. Dr. Berthold Epstein, a Czech pediatrician deported to Auschwitz in 1943 and forced to work in the camp infirmary, testified that prisoner doctors began each day by mentally counting how many patients had survived the night and how many had not, even before they stepped outside the barrack. 4:30 in the morning. Impossible hygiene and the uniform. It is 4:30 in the morning, 15 minutes after the whistle, and the prisoners were expected to look presentable. The concept of hygiene at Auschwitz must be defined precisely, because the gulf between what the SS demanded and what prisoners were physically capable of achieving formed part of the machinery of humiliation and punishment that structured every moment of the day. During the camp's first years, between 1940 and 1941, there were no washing facilities. The Polish prisoners who arrived on the first official transport to Auschwitz, 728 men from the city of Tarnów, on the 14th of June 1940, found no running water in the barracks. When communal washrooms were installed beginning in 1942, they consisted of rows of concrete or metal basins with spaced faucets. Soap was not included in the standard issue. There were no towels. The water was cold at every time of year, and there was no time. The time allowed for washing in the morning was, in practice, whatever remained between using the latrine and the moment when the Blockälteste began shouting that it was time to form ranks. According to testimony collected during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials between 1963 and 1965, that time ranged from 3 to 8 minutes. For a prisoner with open wounds on his feet, his body numb from cold and hunger, splashing cold water onto his face was often all he could manage. The uniform had to be in order. That was the rule. The uniforms consisted of a blue and white striped shirt and trousers made from a mixture of linen and wood fiber, a fabric that provided no protection against the cold, quickly disintegrated under sweat and rain, and scraped mercilessly against the skin. During the early years, there was no underwear. In winter, some prisoners wrapped rags around their feet before putting on their wooden clogs, provided they had rags available. The wooden clogs were themselves an instrument of slow physical destruction. The rigid sole did not conform to the foot. The rough wooden edges rubbed against ankles and heels with every step. Across Birkenau's uneven, waterlogged terrain, each working day produced new abrasions. Without bandages or basic medication, those abrasions became infected. Untreated foot infections progressed into cellulitis, fasciitis, and, in extreme cases, gangrene. Several accounts from the Frankfurt trials describe prisoners arriving at roll call, limping on one healthy foot while the other was already destroyed, held upright only by their fear of the punishment that would follow if they fell. On the uniform was the number. The tattooing system was introduced at Auschwitz in 1941, initially for Soviet prisoners of war, and was extended to all prisoners beginning in 1942. Auschwitz was the only concentration camp in the entire SS network where tattooing prisoners became standard practice. The number was marked on the left forearm with a metal needle and India ink. Records held by the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum document that the numbering system changed several times over the years, with separate series for men, women, Jews, Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war. That number was all that remained of a prisoner's identity. The ordinary prisoner dressing at 4:30 in the morning no longer had an official name. In the mouths of the guards, in camp records, and during roll call, he was only a number. Prisoners who managed to remember one another by their real names, whispering them during the few moments of relative privacy that existed, did so as an act of resistance, even if many would never have described it that way. It was simply the need to remain a person before stepping through the barrack door. At Monowitz, a 15-year-old Hungarian boy named Elie Wiesel prepared at that same hour for another day within the same system, although under a different administration. Deported with his father in August 1944, Wiesel would later write that bread and soup had become his entire existence, a sentence that captured, better than any statistic, what it meant to reduce a whole life to the arithmetic of caloric survival. Women in Birkenau's female sector experienced this moment differently. The women's sector, designated BIA and BIB, had its own washing facilities, equally inadequate, but with an additional burden consistently described in survivors' testimonies. The complete absence of privacy and constant exposure to the gaze of guards, capos, and Blockelteste during moments of personal hygiene. This created a systematic form of humiliation that went beyond the physical conditions. SS Oberaufseherin Maria Mandel, who oversaw the operations of Birkenau's women's camp from October 1942 until November 1944, had established a regime in which personal hygiene inspections could take place at any moment. Failure to meet the required standard of appearance, a standard imposed on people living on 1 liter of soup per day and without soap, was grounds for punishment. Mandel was convicted and executed in Krakow on the 24th of January 1948. 5 in the morning. Roll call. It is 5 in the morning. The Morgenapfel, the morning roll call. Every prisoner in the camp had to assemble on the Appellplatz, the central roll call square, and form perfectly aligned rows of 5, while the SS Blockführer walked along the ranks counting. Roll call lasted for as long as it took to make the numbers match. There was no maximum time limit. No consideration was given to the temperature, rain, snow, or the physical condition of those standing in formation. At Birkenau, the central open area crossed the camp's main axis from east to west. At the height of its population, more than 80,000 people could be standing in that space simultaneously, divided into blocks according to sector. The SS Rapportführer, the non-commissioned officer responsible for the total count, received the figures from each Blockführer and added them together. If the total did not match the previous day's records, plus new arrivals and minus reported deaths, the entire camp remained standing motionless and silent. When the count did not match, the consequences were immediate. There were many reasons for discrepancies. The most common was that someone had died during the night and the body had not been moved or properly reported. In that case, the corpse was dragged out of the barrack and placed in front of the corresponding block's formation so that the number would balance. The other prisoners remained standing motionless beside the body while the Rapportführer completed the count. Only when the figure had been confirmed was permission given to remove the corpse. Primo Levi, the Italian chemist deported to Auschwitz in February 1944 and assigned the number 174517, described winter roll call as one of the camp's most devastating experiences. Standing in the darkness, the cold cutting through the thin fabric of the uniform, feet aching inside wet clogs, waiting without knowing for how long, unable to move, unable to speak, staring straight ahead into nothingness, while the numbers either matched or failed to match, inside the mind of someone who did not care what that waiting was doing to the bodies before him. Testimonies collected by the Polish Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes show that on several occasions, morning roll call lasted more than 3 hours because of discrepancies in the count. In documented cases of attempted escape, punitive roll call could continue throughout the following night, with the entire camp forced to stand for hours in the cold. The most extensively documented punitive roll call occurred in July 1940, when a prisoner escaped from Auschwitz I. The 1,200 prisoners then held in the camp were kept in formation for 20 consecutive hours without food or water, standing on the Appellplatz until the fugitive was found hiding inside a pile of wood within the camp perimeter. As an additional reprisal, 10 prisoners chosen at random were taken to Block 11, the punishment block, where they died of starvation. For the capo, morning roll call was the moment when his authority for the day was consolidated. While the SS Blockführer walked through the ranks recording numbers, the capos mentally classified their men, judging who was fit to work and who was not, and deciding how to organize their detail for the day. A capo who handed too many sick prisoners over to the SS Arbeitsführer, the officer responsible for allocating labor, could lose his position. A capo who sent men to work only for them to collapse at the worksite could also lose his position. The balance between these two pressures was the arithmetic of power inside the camp. The prisoner doctor observed roll call with a clinical eye that no one had asked him to develop, but that the camp had forced upon him out of necessity. While standing at attention in the required silence, he identified those in the ranks who were close to collapse, the visible swelling in their legs, the particular pallor that announced the onset of hypothermia, the stiffness of the neck that could indicate meningitis. He made a mental note. Later, he would try to reach those people before the SS medical selection did. At Monowitz, roll call followed the same brutal logic, but with an additional layer imposed by industrial priorities. IG Farben's civilian foreman company employees who did not belong to the SS often watched the count from a distance, calculating how many pairs of arms would be available that day to meet the synthetic rubber production quotas demanded by the company's management in Frankfurt. The system documented after the war during the Nuremberg trial of 24 IG Farben executives, held between 1,947 and 1,948, showed that the company maintained regular correspondence regarding productivity and demanded harsher disciplinary methods whenever output fell below expectations. The Sonderkommando assembled for roll call separately from the rest of the camp, in the sector beside the crematoria. Their numbers were counted apart. The SS Unterscharführer, responsible for the Sonderkommando, knew them all by number and name, because the nature of their work required more direct supervision than that of other labor details. They were witnesses. That made them valuable and, at the same time, condemned from the beginning. 5:45, the breakfast that was not breakfast. After morning roll call, and before the labor details departed, the camp administration distributed what it officially called breakfast. Calling it breakfast requires an effort of definition, because the distance between that name and what was actually handed out formed part of the system's structural cruelty. It consisted of approximately 300 milliliters of a lukewarm liquid the SS called ersatz coffee or herbal infusion. In practice, survivor testimonies consistently describe something indistinguishable from hot water with a barely perceptible bitter taste. There was no sugar, no milk, nothing solid. The day's bread ration between 250 and 300 grams of dense, compact black rye bread mixed with corn flour was sometimes handed out at that moment, and at other times at noon or in the evening, depending on the Blockhelteste. The irregular timing of the distribution was itself a form of control. Not knowing when the next solid ration would arrive meant being unable to calculate when to eat, unable to plan how to distribute hunger across the day. The question of what to do with the bread was one of the most difficult decisions faced by any ordinary prisoner. Eating it all at once offered an immediate infusion of warmth and calories before work, but left the rest of the day and the entire night without solid food. Saving it meant risking theft. At Birkenau, bread disappeared. The strategies used to preserve it were numerous and all imperfect. Hiding it inside the uniform against the body, placing it beneath one's head at night, or entrusting it to a reliable person for safekeeping. Wisław Kielar, prisoner number 290, from the first transport to Auschwitz and author of the memoir Annus Mundi, published in 1972, described how, during his first months in the camp, he learned to divide his bread into 3 exact portions to be eaten throughout the day. That self-control over the instinct to devour it all at once was one of the first conscious decisions he made in order to survive. The total daily caloric intake of an Auschwitz prisoner in 1942 has been estimated by historian Franciszek Piper of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum at approximately 1,300 to 1,700 kilocalories. A human body performing 12 or more hours of strenuous physical labor requires between 3,000 and 4,000 kilocalories merely to maintain its weight. The gap between what was provided and what the body required was the distance between life and death, measured in weeks. The effects of chronic malnutrition followed a precise medical progression. Starvation, edema, the accumulation of fluid in subcutaneous tissue caused by severe protein deficiency made prisoners' legs and abdomens swell grotesquely while the rest of the body wasted away. Skin ulcers appeared where bones protruded beneath the flesh. Chronic diarrhea, caused both by malnutrition and by the intestinal infections that flourished in the unsanitary latrines, produced constant dehydration. Leaving formation or abandoning work to use the latrine could result in a beating. Remaining in formation and defecating on oneself meant enduring a humiliation the camp had made routine. The capo ate differently. Capos' rations did not follow the same conditions as those of ordinary prisoners. Officially, the capo received the same standard ration as everyone else. In reality, his position gave him access to what others could only glimpse from a distance. The bottom of the soup container, thicker and more nutritious than the watery surface served to those at the front of the line. The possibility of receiving a second helping in the kitchen. Access to the portion of margarine or sausage that was theoretically meant to be divided equally, but in practice reached the hands of the person who controlled its distribution. The Sonderkommando member ate breakfast with whatever was available in his underground quarters. Their rations were objectively superior to those of the rest of the camp. More bread, margarine more regularly, occasional access to sausages and canned food taken from the confiscated luggage of deportees. The SS provided these better rations because the Sonderkommando needed to retain the physical strength required for work that was as physically exhausting as it was psychologically devastating. Philipp Müller described these meals as one of the most disturbing aspects of his existence in the Sonderkommando. Eating relatively well, while everything else was happening only meters away, was a form of material complicity carried out by the stomach without asking permission from the conscience. At Monowitz, the additional ration known among prisoners as Buna Soupe, a watery soup distributed as a supplement to their already inadequate rations, was one of the few elements that marginally distinguished the food experience of the industrial subcamp from that of Birkenau. It did not change the final outcome, a life expectancy of 3 to 4 months for a Jewish worker at the IG Farben plant. 6 in the morning, the gate opens, the march, and the music. At 6 in the morning, the gate of Auschwitz, I opened. Above it, in wrought iron letters made in the camp's own metal workshop by prisoner Jan Liwacz, stood the inscription, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. It was a lie installed on Rudolf Höss's orders during the camp's first months. There was no possible redemption beyond that threshold. What did exist at the gate was the orchestra, created in July 1941 at the initiative of SS Hauptscharführer Hans Aumir. The Auschwitz Orchestra began as a group of around a dozen prisoner musicians who played marches while the labor details left at dawn and returned at dusk. Its function was administrative. The music established the rhythm, the prisoners marched 5 abreast in time with it, and the guards could count them without stopping the columns. Over time, the orchestra grew to nearly 100 members. Its repertoire included German military marches and, occasionally, melodies from Viennese operettas. The contrast between those bright melodies and the physical condition of the people marching to their rhythm formed part of the machinery of humiliation. The music softened nothing. It formalized the horror with the structure of a parade. Birkenau's women's orchestra became the best documented of all the orchestras that existed within the complex. It operated in the women's sector beginning in the spring of 1943, and at its largest, consisted of approximately 47 members of different nationalities. Beginning in July 1943, it was directed by Alma Rosé, niece of the composer Gustav Mahler and daughter of Arnold Rosé, concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic. A professional violinist, she had attempted to escape Europe after the Anschluss of 1938 and was arrested in Belgium while trying to cross into Switzerland. She imposed the standards of a professional conservatory on the group because she understood that an orchestra considered dispensable was an orchestra condemned to death. It was the only strategy of collective survival available to them. Alma Rosé died at Auschwitz on the 4th of April 1944, under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. She was 37 years old. Being a musician was a privilege that could mean the difference between life and death. Members of the orchestra did not perform heavy physical labor, and their functional value to the SS protected them from the most immediate selections. But there was a psychological price, which several of them later described: playing cheerful marches while dying. Men and women left for the labor that would kill them was a form of forced complicity. The camp imposed on each musician without consent. The labor details departed in columns 5 abreast. A prisoner's assignment to a particular detail depended on the occupation he declared during the admission process, the changing demand for labor, and the camp's internal system of influence and connections. Within the camp's vocabulary, there were good details and bad details, and the difference was not abstract. It was the difference between lasting for weeks and lasting for months. The good details were those that worked indoors, demanded less physical effort, and offered some possibility of access to warmth or additional food. The kitchen detail was the most coveted. Proximity to food in an environment of chronic starvation had incalculable survival value. The construction detail was different. Birkenau had been built on swampy, poorly drained ground, filled with insects in summer and frozen in winter. Prisoners assigned to construction dug foundations in saturated soil, carried bricks, and pushed wheelbarrows that sank into the mud. No gloves, no proper boots, no tools in good condition. The capos judged their performance by sight. If a wheelbarrow stopped, the blow came. The strafkommando, the punishment detail, was the system's most explicit instrument of destruction. Assigned to prisoners who had committed serious infractions, it received reduced rations and the most physically devastating tasks available. Testimonies from the Frankfurt trials described its return to camp at dusk as a procession of figures who could barely remain on their feet. When the final detail passed through the gate, the orchestra put away its instruments. The camp was left almost empty. Only the internal details remained inside the perimeter. Prisoners assigned to domestic work, cleaning barracks, emptying latrines, performing maintenance, along with the sick and the bodies of those who had died during the night, waiting to be removed. At Monowitz, the departure for the IG Farben plant followed a different rhythm. Prisoners marched several kilometers to the industrial complex under SS guard. Then began a working day jointly supervised by SS non-commissioned officers and the company's civilian foreman. Primo Levi, transferred to Monowitz because of his training as a chemist, described the plant as a place without hope, gray from end to end, a tangle of iron, concrete, mud, and smoke that constituted, in his own words, the very negation of beauty. Its streets and buildings were designated by numbers and letters, like the prisoners themselves, when they did not bear inhuman and sinister names. 8 in the morning, 12 hours against the body. 2 hours after departure, the labor details were at their workplaces. Labor at Auschwitz was not primarily intended to produce wealth. Rudolf Höss wrote in his memoirs that he had received explicit instructions from Heinrich Himmler that prisoners were to be worked to the point of total exhaustion, and that destruction through labor was as acceptable as any other form of extermination, provided it served the needs of the Reich. This was not a later interpretation developed by historians. It was SS doctrine, and it was consistently applied. The length of the working day varied according to the period. During the camp's first years, between 1940 and 1941, it could extend to 14 hours in summer. Beginning in 1942, following the rationalization imposed by the concentration camps inspectorate under SS Gruppenführer Richard Gluck's, the standard working day was set at 11 hours of effective labor, although in practice it depended on the detail and on the capo. For an ordinary prisoner assigned to a Birkenau construction detail, 8 in the morning already meant 2 hours of sustained exertion. Birkenau's clay soil waterlogged, frozen in winter and muddy in spring was a constant enemy. The available tools were minimal: shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. Production quotas: cubic meters of earth moved, linear meters of trench excavated. Number of loads transported were established by SS supervisors and communicated to the capo, who passed them downward with the implicit or explicit threat of what would happen if they were not met. The relationship between the prisoner and the capo formed the central axis of the working day. The capo existed in a permanent balance between two opposing pressures: Above him were the SS guards and the Unterscharführer supervising the detail, demanding output and punishing capos whose collective productivity was considered insufficient. Below him were the prisoners, who depended on him to survive the day and who sometimes attempted to negotiate, to the limited extent that negotiation was possible in that environment, for conditions that were slightly less lethal. The capo who achieved a workable balance between those two pressures survived in his position. One who leaned too far toward unlimited brutality lost the usefulness of having prisoners still capable of working. One who became too lenient lost his post. In If This Is a Man, Primo Levi described a capo named Alex, whose surname he never learned, as a man who struck prisoners out of habit rather than calculated cruelty. That did not make the blows any less painful, but it did make them predictable. And in the universe of Auschwitz, predictability possessed a value that would be incomprehensible outside the camp. For the prisoner doctor, the morning's work began in the infirmary. The Revier, the informal name for the camp infirmary, was a place that concentrated one of Auschwitz's sharpest paradoxes. It was the only place where a prisoner could receive anything resembling medical care, and at the same time it was one of the places where selections for death occurred most regularly. Entering the Revier was a calculated gamble that every sick prisoner had to make alone. Was it worth risking selection by an SS doctor in exchange for a few days of rest that might mean the difference between remaining functional and collapsing permanently? The Sonderkommando began its intensive work when the first transport of the day arrived. The transports followed no fixed schedule, but during the periods of greatest activity, especially between May and July 1944, during the deportation of Hungarian Jews, several could arrive each day, at any hour. When a transport arrived, the machinery of the Sonderkommando went into motion with an efficiency designed by the system itself and executed by its members under threat of death if they failed. The testimony of Marcel Nadjari, a Greek Jew from Thessaloniki who survived as a member of the Sonderkommando and whose manuscript, buried near Crematorium 3, was discovered and deciphered in 2017, describes the sequence with a precision untouched by the comfort of historical distance. The deportees descended into the underground undressing room, hung their clothes on numbered hooks, and were directed toward the gas chamber. The doors closed. SS Sanitäter climbed onto the roof and poured Zyklon B through the openings. The Sonderkommando waited outside. Between 10 and 20 minutes later, the doors were opened. At Monowitz, 8 in the morning found the prisoners already fully at work inside the IG Farben plant, erecting steel structures, laying pipes, carrying sacks of chemical materials without any respiratory protection against fumes that burned their lungs. The company's civilian foremen demanded productivity with the same harshness as the capos. Internal company reports later introduced as evidence during the Nuremberg trial of IG Farben's executives reveal constant correspondence between the plant and corporate headquarters in Frankfurt, demanding more severe disciplinary methods whenever synthetic rubber production failed to meet established targets. More than 10,000 prisoners died as a direct consequence of working for IG Farben at Monowitz, through selections that sent them back to Birkenau's gas chambers, death from exhaustion at the construction site itself, and summary execution for sabotage or attempted escape. 12 noon, the soup. The labor details stopped. The break lasted between 20 minutes and 1 hour, depending on the detail and the period. Prisoners working inside the camp could return to the barracks to receive the midday meal. Those working at external sites received their food at the workplace, transported in large metal containers by other prisoners. The midday meal was the true center of the daily diet. It consisted of approximately 1 liter of soup, prepared in the camp kitchens from whatever ingredients were available, usually turnips, cabbage, nettles, radishes, or simply water with oatmeal suspended in it. During periods of greatest scarcity, testimony presented at the Nuremberg trials described a soup whose nutritional value was practically non-existent. The weakest prisoners sometimes reached the container with a metal bowl in their hands but could not hold it steady because their hands were trembling. A prisoner's position in the soup line was a matter of life and death on a microscopic scale. Those at the front received the liquid from the top of the container clearer, more diluted, with fewer solids. Those at the end received the bottom, thicker and containing more pieces of turnip or whatever else had been cooked. The difference between the two ends of the line could amount to 100 or 200 kilocalories. Within a daily diet of 1,300 kilocalories, that difference was significant. Reaching the end of the line required bargaining, paying with bread. having connections with the Blockhelteste, or being strong enough to impose oneself. The food distribution system was itself a mechanism that reproduced and amplified the camp's hierarchies of power. The weakest, the people who most needed the nutritious sediment at the bottom of the soup, were those least likely to receive it. Writer and survivor Jean Améry, who passed through Auschwitz in 1943, wrote in At the Mind's Limits, published in German in 1966, that hunger in the camp could not be compared with any form of hunger known outside it, not because of its intensity, but because of its temporal horizon. Outside the camp, hunger carries the expectation that it will eventually end. Inside the camp, that horizon did not exist. Today's hunger was identical to tomorrow's, and to the hunger of the following week. That endless horizon altered a person's relationship with his own body, in a way Améry described as a form of irreversible alienation. In Birkenau's women's sector, soup distribution followed the same logic, with additional tensions. Survivors consistently described how female SS guards used mealtimes as opportunities for inspection and punishment. If a barrack failed to maintain the required order during distribution, its ration could be delayed or reduced as collective punishment. The capo ate separately. His ration differed not only in quantity but in access. In some details, capos received additional bread taken from the rations of prisoners who had died that morning. The day's deaths were not reported until the end of the midday break. Until then, their rations still existed within the system. The final minutes of the midday break, when the soup containers were already empty and only residue remained stuck to their metal walls, produced scenes that several survivors described as among the most painful of their entire experience in the camp. Prisoners who had failed to reach the line in time, or whose ration had been so small that their hunger remained unbearable, surrounding the empty containers and attempting to scrape away the remains with their fingers or improvised spoons. At Monowitz, the Buna Soupe was distributed during a brief break inside the industrial complex itself, under the eyes of the company's civilian foremen, who timed the pause with the same rigor they applied to production. 1 in the afternoon shift, the body gives out. The guard's whistle marked the end of the midday break. The labor details returned to their workstations. For most ordinary prisoners, the afternoon was harder than the morning. The short break had restored nothing, but it had interrupted the continuous state of exertion, forcing the body to start again from a deeper level of exhaustion and with fewer reserves. In winter, the afternoon light over Birkenau disappeared at around 3 or 4 o'clock. Once darkness fell, the outdoor details continued working under the lights of the watchtowers or beneath portable lamps carried by the guards themselves. The demands were not reduced because of poor visibility. Darkness was simply another condition of work, like the cold or the mud. Accidents increased after dark. Falls, blows from tools, sprains, and accidents within Auschwitz had consequences entirely different from those at any ordinary workplace. There was no medical leave, no guaranteed treatment, and an injury that would have been minor elsewhere could mark the beginning of the decline into the condition known as Muselman. Muselman was the term prisoners themselves used for someone who had reached the point of no return. Documented at Auschwitz and several other concentration camps from the early years of the war, the word described a man or woman who had lost the ability to respond to the surrounding world. The body continued moving, but consciousness had withdrawn somewhere inaccessible. They walked like automatons, stopped eating even when food was placed in front of them, did not react to blows, and looked without seeing. Primo Levi described them as the drowned who still moved, but whose inner spark had already gone out. Other prisoners avoided the Muselman not necessarily out of cruelty, although cruelty existed, but because he was an unbearable reflection of what could happen to them. The distance between a functioning prisoner and a Muselman was not great. A cold that developed into pneumonia, a foot infection that spread up the leg, 3 consecutive days of reduced rations as punishment, the death of someone close, removing the will to continue calculating. The Muselman was proof that the body had a limit, and that the camp had been designed specifically to reach it. To the SS, a Muselman was an exhausted resource. He would be selected during the next medical inspection. The prisoner doctor spent the afternoon between the infirmary and fear. The fear experienced by prisoner doctors at Auschwitz was not merely fear of arbitrary punishment, although that fear was also present. It was a more specific fear, the fear of being ordered to participate in something that would transform them into instruments of the machinery of destruction. SS doctors, particularly Josef Mengele and his team, sometimes used prisoner doctors as assistants in procedures they did not wish to perform themselves, or for which they required specialized knowledge. Refusal was virtually impossible. Acceptance carried a cost that none of the survivors was ever able to fully resolve in memoirs or testimony. Dr. Miklos Nyszly, a Hungarian forensic physician who arrived at Auschwitz with his family in May 1944 and was selected by Mengele to serve as his assistant in the crematoria, published his memoirs in 1946 under the title Auschwitz, a doctor's eyewitness account. His descriptions of afternoons spent in Mengele's laboratory performing autopsies on twins killed during experiments, analyzing the results of injections administered by Mengele, and recording the findings in reports that Mengele signed and sent to the SS Institute for Racial Research in Berlin, are perhaps the most detailed and disturbing testimony of medicine transformed into an instrument of extermination. In the SS agricultural details, the afternoon followed its own dynamic. The experimental farms and cultivated fields established around the camp formed part of the agricultural colonization project Himmler had envisioned for the region. Auschwitz was to become a model of German agricultural exploitation in conquered Polish territory. Prisoners in these details sometimes took advantage of their relative distance from direct supervision to do what camp slang called organizing, a term used for any method of obtaining resources outside the official system. A beet hidden inside a uniform pocket, a piece of carrot eaten directly from the soil. At Monowitz, the afternoon brought the specific danger of Allied bombing. Beginning in August 1944, the United States Army Air Forces repeatedly attacked the IG Farben plant, which was considered a legitimate military target because of its production of synthetic fuel. The prisoners were forced to remain at their workstations during air raid alarms, while the SS guards sheltered in bunkers constructed for their own use. Prisoners suffered direct casualties from the Allied bombs, an irony that several survivors would later describe without ever fully resolving their own ambivalent feelings toward the raids. Each bomb that fell on the factory that was killing them through exhaustion was also a step toward the end of the war that might save them. 5. In the afternoon. Evening roll call. The afternoon whistle called the labor details back. Those working within the camp set down their tools and formed ranks at the worksite before marching toward the Appellplatz. Those who had worked outside in the agricultural fields, on construction sites beyond the perimeter, or in the sorting warehouses known as Canada marched back in columns, passing through the gate beneath the watchful eyes of the guards who counted them. Those who had died during the afternoon also returned. Their bodies were carried or dragged by the other members of the detail, because the SS counted corpses in the same way they counted the living. The Abendappell, the evening roll call, was in many ways more feared than the morning count. It was the moment when the SS used what had been observed during the working day to impose public punishment. The SS Lagerführer and the officers on duty could order formal beatings, punitive exercises, known as Strafexerzieren, which involved repeatedly crouching and standing until collapse, or simply force prisoners to remain in formation for additional hours after the count as punishment without any declared cause. Flogging was a regulated punishment, a fact that made it more brutal, not less. The Lagerordnung, the camp regulations, stipulated that a flogging required the knowledge and signature of the commandant, and that the maximum number of blows was 25. In practice, according to testimony from the Frankfurt trials, floggings were often administered routinely, without any formal procedure. The instrument was a leather whip or wooden rod. The condemned prisoner was tied to a wooden bench known in camp slang as the horse. A Blockelteste recorded the blows. The prisoner had to count them aloud in German. If he made a mistake or remained silent, the count began again with the first blow. The public function of punishment was part of the design. Punishment administered on the Appellplatz during evening roll call was visible to every prisoner in the camp. Female survivors described the effort required to keep their eyes fixed forward and show no reaction, because displaying horror, pity, or visible solidarity could attract a guard's attention and turn the observer into the next victim. The camp trained its prisoners to display external emotional stillness as a condition of survival. For the capo, evening roll call was the moment of accountability. He had to give the SS Unterscharführer an exact report of his detail. How many had worked, how many had fallen ill during the day, and how many had died. If the number of deaths was high, there would be questions. If the detail's output was considered insufficient by the SS supervisor, there would be questions. A capo who left evening roll call without being punished or warned considered the day relatively successful. The Sonderkommando finished its work when the final transport of the day had been processed. During periods of intense activity, this might not occur until late in the afternoon or after nightfall. The men returned to their underground sleeping quarters, physically exhausted and carrying the weight of what they had done that day. The alcohol regularly supplied by the SS was consumed during those transitional hours between the end of the day and the attempt to sleep. The women assigned to the Union munitions factory, located in one of Birkenau's subcamps, finished their shift during those same afternoon hours under particularly strict surveillance. The nature of their work, the handling of gunpowder and explosive components, required absolute control over every gram of material entering and leaving the plant. And yet it was precisely within that seemingly absolute control that several of them found, during the course of 1944, a crack wide enough to smuggle out, gram by gram, the material that would make possible one of the few armed uprisings ever carried out inside the complex. At Monowitz, evening roll call took place after the long march back from the IG Farben plant, a journey that consumed the little energy remaining in bodies that had already endured 12 hours of industrial labor. According to Primo Levi, prisoners who collapsed during that return march were carried by their companions under the threat that anyone unable to keep pace would be reported as unfit to continue working, a report that almost always amounted to a death sentence. 7 in the evening, free time that was not free. After Abendappel, once the count had been completed and the day's punishments administered, the order was given to disperse. The prisoners had between 30 and 45 minutes before the signal for silence. It was the only fragment of the day not completely regulated, and within it were concentrated strategies for survival, forms of resistance, and also the most devastating betrayals. Food always came first. Dinner, which in certain periods consisted of an additional ration of 150 to 200 grams of bread, sometimes accompanied by a spoonful of margarine or a piece of sausage of dubious quality, and in other periods consisted of absolutely nothing was distributed inside the barracks, unless it had already been handed out before Abendappel. Saving part of that meal for the early morning was risky because it could be stolen. Eating it all immediately offered instant relief, but left the hours before dawn without solid food. The black market at Auschwitz was a real institution. Canada, the area where the confiscated belongings of deportees were stored and sorted, generated a constant flow of objects that circulated through the camp during these hours of relative freedom. Prisoners who worked sorting clothing and luggage in Canada had access to items of enormous value inside the camp: preserved food, medicine, extra clothing, cigarettes. According to the testimony of several survivors during the Frankfurt trials, one packet of cigarettes was worth between 4 and 8 bread rations on Auschwitz's black market. Cigarettes were the camp's true currency. The exchanges took place in whispers along the barrack walls, in the spaces between bunks, and in the corridors of the Appellplatz whenever the guards were not looking directly at them. It was a parallel economic system that the SS partly tolerated because it encouraged privileged prisoners to cooperate in maintaining the camp's general order, and partly because eliminating it would have required a level of internal surveillance that was impossible to sustain. Primo Levi described those minutes of free time as the only part of the day in which the mind could function. Not in the sense of thinking clearly, hunger and exhaustion made that impossible, but in the sense that there was a tiny fraction of time not occupied by immediate terror. Within that space, some prisoners talked. They did not talk about the camp, because speaking openly about the camp was both dangerous and redundant. They talked about what had existed before: cities, jobs, cooking recipes, the names of people. The verbal recovery of the outside world within the camp was one of the few ways available to preserve the idea that they had existed as individuals before the number was tattooed on their forearms. For the prisoner doctor, the evening was also a time to attempt to write. Writing was absolutely forbidden. Possessing a pencil or paper could cost a prisoner his life, and yet some still wrote, hiding writing materials in places that frequent SS searches did not always uncover. Beneath the straw of the bunks, sewn into the hems of uniforms, concealed within cracks in the wooden walls. The diary of Zalman Lewenthal, a Sonderkommando member whose Yiddish writing was found in a jar buried near Crematorium 3 in 1962, was written on irregular pieces of wrapping paper with imperfect Polish spelling. It is not a literary diary. It is a chronicle of what happened. written by someone who knew he would probably not survive to tell the story, and wanted at least the paper to survive. Religious prisoners, particularly Orthodox Jews, used those minutes to pray. Praying aloud was forbidden. Silent prayer was physically impossible for the guards to detect, although the movement of the lips could attract attention. Survivors who had practiced Orthodox Judaism described the effort to mentally preserve the structure of the evening prayers without speaking a single word, an act of religious memory that was simultaneously an act of resistance against the camp's attempt to erase the individual. The camp denied people their names. Praying in the language of the name of God was an affirmation that this name still existed. The 30 minutes of free time ended with the whistle at 9 in the evening. It was precisely within the context of these hours of relative freedom, and through the network of exchanges connecting Canada with the Union Munitions Factory, that one of the most extensively documented acts of resistance in the entire complex developed over the course of 1944. 4 women, Rosa Robota, Esther Wagblum, Regina Safirstein, and Alla Gertner, worked in the gunpowder section of the Union Factory in a Birkenau subcamp under SS surveillance that accounted for every gram of material entering and leaving the plant. For weeks, they succeeded in smuggling out small fragments of explosives, hiding them in the hems of their clothes and inside their shoes, and passing them to members of the Sonderkommando. Accumulated little by little, those fragments enabled the Sonderkommando to produce the crude explosives used in the uprising of the 7th of October 1944. The prisoners of Crematorium 4, knowing they were about to be liquidated like the Sonderkommando groups before them, attacked the SS guards with those explosives, partially set the building on fire, and killed several members of the garrison before being almost entirely wiped out. It was the only direct armed attack against the machinery of extermination in the entire history of the camp. The 4 women were discovered weeks later, tortured inside Block 11, and publicly hanged on Birkenau's Appellplatz on the 6th of January 1945, barely 3 weeks before the Red Army entered the camp. According to the testimony of one witness who was present, Rosa Robota's final words, spoken in Hebrew, were an appeal for strength and courage, addressed to the prisoners whom the Soviet troops would find alive only 3 weeks later. 9 in the evening. The signal for silence. The 9 o'clock whistle was the signal for every prisoner to be in his or her bunk, silent, with hands visible above the blanket during periods when blankets were available. The lights inside the barrack remained dimly illuminated, bright enough for the Stubendienst, the prisoner responsible for each section, to see whether anyone moved. The Blockelteste made a final round before the main light was turned off. He checked that the number of prisoners inside the barrack matched the figure on the roll call list. He inspected whether the bunks were occupied by the correct people. Prisoners frequently exchanged places to favor certain individuals within the barrack's internal hierarchy. The Blockelteste knew this, and either tolerated it or did not, according to his own judgment. He checked that no food was visible, although he knew food was hidden everywhere. Then he withdrew to his separate quarters. The uninsulated wooden barracks allowed the Polish cold to pass freely inside. In winter, the interior temperature could fall below freezing. The 3-tiered bunks stacked prisoners in layers. Those on the upper level experienced more cold because, although heat rises, the wooden structure retained none of it. They were, however, farther from the smell of the nighttime latrine buckets and the dampness of the floor. Those on the lower level absorbed the moisture from the packed earth ground, especially on rainy nights when water seeped beneath the barrack walls. Those in the middle benefited from the relative warmth of bodies both above and below them. Sharing a bunk with 2 or 3 people was common during periods of overcrowding. It offered the advantage of shared body heat, which on winter nights could mean the difference between waking and not waking. It also meant constant movement from those who coughed, those who rose to use the buckets, and those who cried out or muttered in their sleep. And it created vulnerability to theft. Sleeping beside another hungry person, which meant everyone, and keeping food close to the body, was an act of trust that sometimes ended in betrayal. Using the latrines at night was a problem the camp had deliberately left unresolved. Each barrack contained wooden barrels or buckets placed in the corners as nighttime latrines. With 400 or more people in a single barrack, those containers filled before midnight. Chronic diarrhea, endemic in the camp because of the quality of the water and food, meant demand remained constant throughout the night. When the buckets filled, they overflowed. Leaving the barrack at night to use the outside latrines was theoretically permitted until a certain hour. In practice, the night guards could shoot at any moving shadow outside the barracks after the signal for silence. In Block 11 at Auschwitz I, the night was different. Block 11, known as the death block, was the punishment block. Its basement cells included the so-called standing cells, concrete chambers measuring 90 by 90 centimeters in which 4 people were forced to spend the night without being able to sit or lie down. The forced standing position caused circulatory damage in the legs, beginning with numbness, progressing to acute pain, and eventually producing the inability to remain upright. The occupants of the standing cells were taken out during the day to work, because the SS demanded productivity even from prisoners under punishment, and were returned to the cells at night. Several did not survive until morning. The black wall in the courtyard between blocks 10 and 11 was the site of executions. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 20,000 people, primarily Polish prisoners, but also members of resistance movements from other nationalities and prisoners, selected for reasons that were sometimes never recorded, were executed against that wall during the years the camp operated. Executions were preferably carried out in the morning, before the labor details departed, so they would not be witnessed by the rest of the camp. But the nights preceding an execution, when a condemned prisoner already knew what would happen at dawn, were a particular kind of night that no other prisoner experienced. Midnight. What happened while the camp slept? The camp never slept completely. Birkenau's watchtowers, wooden structures approximately 3.5 meters high positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter, remained active 24 hours a day. Searchlights swept across the interior of the camp in regular cycles. The high-voltage electrified fences, carrying between 220 and 380 volts, depending on the sector, and the period remained active throughout the night. Birkenau's outer perimeter measured more than 5 kilometers. Auschwitz I, more compact, had a system of fences and watchtowers extending around approximately 2.5 kilometers. Deaths during the night were part of the routine. The body of a prisoner who had reached the edge of collapse could fail completely during the hours of darkness. In winter, hypothermia killed the weakest before dawn. Those sleeping beside the dead sometimes did not realize what had happened until the Stubendienst made his rounds before roll call. The corpse was quietly removed before formation so that the numbers would match. The SS night guards had their own instructions. Patrols between the barracks were conducted at irregular intervals, making it difficult for prisoners to predict moments of reduced surveillance. The guards were authorized to shoot without warning at any prisoner found outside a barrack after curfew. In the SS quarters, a few hundred meters from the prisoners' barracks, midnight was different. Facilities for SS personnel at the Auschwitz complex included apartment blocks for non-commissioned officers and their families, a casino with a bar, a theater, a cinema, and a swimming pool for summer use. Commandant Rudolf Höss lived with his wife Hedwig and their 5 children in a 2-story villa beside the outer wall of Auschwitz I. It had a garden, domestic servants drawn from the prisoner population, and flowers planted by one of those prisoners and watered every afternoon. Höss wrote about this coexistence in his memoirs without any apparent ability to understand what he was describing. He wrote that the work exhausted him, that he had difficulty sleeping, that he felt the weight of the responsibility involved in administering such a large complex. He did not connect that exhaustion with the nature of what he had built. What he saw from his garden were logistical problems, capacity quotas, and productivity figures. At midnight, some Blockelteste did something no one had ordered them to do. Survivor testimonies include, amid the overwhelming majority of accounts of brutality and arbitrariness, a small number of stories about barrack supervisors who, at night, when the guards were absent and the others were sleeping, quietly redistributed additional portions of bread to the weakest prisoners. Some whispered warnings to prisoners who were going to be included in a medical selection the next day, giving them time to try to hide or arrange a transfer. These actions occurred. They do not change the nature of the system, but they occurred, and their existence is part of the complete history. Midnight was also the hour when patients in the Revier died most frequently. Prisoner doctors who spent the night in the infirmary, something that was not always possible, because their presence depended on authorization from the SS guard on duty, described midnight as the period of greatest mortality. The human body has its own cycles, and the gravely ill die more frequently during the coldest hours before dawn. Without adequate heating, without medicine, with the temperature inside the infirmary barrack falling close to freezing, the coming of dawn became a purge. 3 in the morning, the darkest hours, 1 hour and 15 minutes before the next whistle. For those who had managed to sleep, the sleep of 3 in the morning was at its deepest, but also at its most fragile. A malnourished and exhausted body slept differently from a healthy one. In some respects, the sleep was heavier. In others, it was constantly interrupted. Nighttime diarrhea, muscular cramps caused by the potassium and magnesium deficiencies associated with chronic malnutrition, and the cold seeping through the wooden barrack walls created a constellation of interruptions that meant few people managed to sleep for more than 3 or 4 consecutive hours. Nightmares were universal. Prisoners dreamed of food, of their homes, and of people who had disappeared during selections on the ramp, during punitive roll calls, and during nights when the barrack had awakened to find corpses among the living. In If This Is a Man, Primo Levi described a recurring nightmare in which he tried to tell someone everything he had experienced, but the person did not listen, walked away, or disappeared before he could finish. It was, he wrote, the dream of the impossibility of bearing witness. At 3 in the morning, the capo usually slept in his individual bunk, but not all of them slept. Some capos, those who had spent longer in the camp, those who had witnessed enough selections to understand that their position did not make them immortal, but merely protected them temporarily, spent portions of the night awake with a form of insomnia that had no cure, because it did not arise from anxiety but from calculation. The capo who survived at Auschwitz was neither the most brutal nor the weakest. He was the one who managed to maintain a balance between the demands of the SS and the minimum functionality of the prisoners under his control, day after day, without allowing the system to destroy him for moving too far in either direction. That calculation did not disappear during sleep. For the Sonderkommando, 3 in the morning could be the hour of the next summons. Transports regularly arrived at night during the periods of highest activity, and the Sonderkommando had to rise whenever they came, regardless of the hour. There was no formal advance warning. The arrival of a train was the signal. The SS Unterscharführer, responsible for the night shift, awakened the Sonderkommando, who had to be ready and operational within minutes. At Monowitz, 3 in the morning found prisoners in perhaps the most precarious sleep anywhere in the complex. Although their barracks nominally had windows and heating, they housed men whose bodies had spent the day enduring 12 hours of heavy industrial labor, exposure to corrosive chemicals, and the constant fear of Allied bombs that might fall on the nearby factory at any moment during the night. 4 in the morning, the eve of the following day, 15 minutes before the next whistle, the camp was at its quietest. The night patrols had been reduced to the guards in the watchtowers, who continued their rotating shifts. The barracks were almost silent, interrupted only by coughing, the chronic cough of prisoners suffering from respiratory infections that affected most of the population during winter, the noise of the latrine buckets, and the indescribable sound made by hundreds of human bodies attempting to sleep in a space far too small for them. In the underground sleeping quarters of the crematoria, some members of the Sonderkommando were awake. Marcel Najari wrote in his buried pages that he used the hours before dawn to write, when the rest of the detachment was sleeping and surveillance was minimal. He wrote during those hours because they were the only ones not assigned to a task. He wrote about what he had seen, about the people he had watched arrive, and about the names he had heard inside the undressing room, while families still spoke to one another without knowing what awaited them on the other side of the steel door. Najari knew he would probably die in the camp. He wrote so that the paper would not die. The prisoner doctors who had spent the night in the revier silently counted those who had died. It was not an emotional count. It could not be, because the camp had long since forced them to create distance between feeling and function. It was a logistical count. How many had died? How many required immediate care before roll call? How many might survive the day with the available resources, and how many probably would not? At 4 in the morning, the camp had been operating for 16 hours since the previous evening's roll call, and had been functioning for 4 years since the first transport arrived from Tarnow. The ordinary prisoner who was still alive at that moment knew this, although not in those words. He knew it in the way the body knows things that the mind tries not to formulate, that he had survived another day, that the next one would begin in 15 minutes, and that these two facts were connected but guaranteed nothing about the following day, or the one after that. Survival at Auschwitz was not cumulative. Each day existed independently of the others, in the sense that surviving it generated no right to survive the next. Wisław Kila wrote in Annus Mundi that he had learned to think in units of 1 day, not 1 week, not 1 month, 1 day. Making sure that the day ended with his number still active in the camp records was the only objective that made sense. At 4:15 in the morning, the whistle sounded again. The cycle began once more. The day in numbers, the scale of the terror. To understand what those 24 hours meant on a larger scale, it is necessary to leave the barrack and look at the complex as a whole. On any given day in 1943, Auschwitz-Birkenau processed, administered, and destroyed lives on a scale without equivalent in human history. The administrative records of the SS, the Sterkemeldungen, the daily strength reports, each camp sent to the concentration camps inspectorate in Oranienburg, documented with bureaucratic precision the number of active prisoners each day, the arrivals, transfers, and reported deaths. What they did not document, because no category for it existed on their forms, was the number of people murdered directly in the crematoria without ever being registered. After decades of research at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, historian František Pijper estimated that of the approximately 1.3 million people deported to Auschwitz, between 1,940 and 1,945, around 900,000, 70%, were murdered immediately upon arrival without ever being entered into the camp's records. They arrived, stepped down from the train, were directed to the left during selection, and disappeared. They have no tattooed number. In most cases, their names appear in no surviving record. The 400,000 registered prisoners, the people who experienced the 24-hour routine described in this account, represented a minority of those who passed through Auschwitz. Of those 400,000 registered prisoners, more than 200,000 died in the camp from disease, starvation, executions, or medical experiments. Those who were liberated or transferred to other camps before liberation make up the remainder. Fewer than 90,000 people who had been registered prisoners at Auschwitz survived until the end of the war. Each one of those people had, at some point, lived through a version of the 24 hours described in this script. Each of those 24-hour periods was identical in structure: the whistle, roll call, labor, soup, evening roll call, silence, and radically different in the details that determined whether a particular person would live to hear the next whistle. The ordinary prisoner who carried bricks, the capo who supervised him, the doctor who tried to save one or both of them, the Monowitz laborer whose body fed the synthetic rubber production of a private company, and the Sonderkommando member who processed in the basements of the crematoria what the rest of the camp could barely imagine. All shared the same electrified perimeter, the same sky, and the same number of hours. None of them shared the same fate. And at some point within that 24-hour clock, repeated across 1,700 consecutive days, every one of them, without exception, heard the same whistle sound again at 4:15 in the morning.